The Biophilic Leadership Summit is the only multi-day conference entirely dedicated to biophilic projects, principles, and research, bringing together the top industry leaders in an intimate, natural setting to network, build partnerships, and learn from each other.
This year's summit will explore biophilic placemaking and how we can use biophilic principles to promote health, happiness, and vitality in public spaces.
In addition to fascinating presentations, delicious farm-to-table meals at Serenbe, and cocktails, this year's summit will feature a selection of biophilic experiences like forest bathing, bird watching, and more.
So join us in Serenbe for the 6th Annual Biophilic Leadership Summit from March 24th to March 26th, 2024.
Learn more about the summit and register today at biophilic.summit.com.
That's biophilic.summit.com. We hope to see you there.
Hi, I'm Monica Olson.
And I'm Jennifer Walsh.
And you're listening to the Biophilic Solutions Podcast, where every other week we sit down with experts and thought leaders across industries in order to explore the innate connection between humans and nature and why we need nature to thrive.
We truly believe that in order to tackle the global environmental problems we're facing, we as humans must reconnect to the natural world and come to a better understanding of how we fit in and how we are so interconnected. So in every episode, we'll interview new guests that help us uncover and highlight nature-based solutions to get us on a path to greater health, tackling climate change, and ultimately getting outside and connecting with nature.
So let's get to today's episode. Hi, Jennifer.
Hey, Monica.
Jennifer, we're going to have to get right into this episode because it is jam-packed with big, important topics.
Yes, it is for sure. So today we're talking about the intersection of nature and how it affects politics, democracy, and the environment. The current state of democracy, and spoiler warning, it's not great. How we got here and what it means for how we move forward with both biophilic strategies and policies. We also talk about the role that biophilia can play in all of this.
Yes. And so we're covering a lot of territory today, but luckily we have a fabulous guest helping us wade through it all. His name is David Orr. He was the Paul Sears Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Politics Emeritus and a senior advisor to the president of Oberlin College. He is a prolific author and worked extensively on the intersection of climate and politics, authoring 8 books, most recently editor of Democracy Unchained, How to Rebuild Government for the People. This was a collection of essays from leading thinkers about how we can reboot our democracy. And his latest project that we chatted about a bit is called Democracy in a Hotter Time, being released in 2023.
Yes. In the mid-1990s, David also oversaw the planning and building for Oberlin College Adam Joseph Lewis Center, one of our country's first true biophilic buildings.
Yeah, and David is an absolutely fabulous resource. He really puts things into perspective in a way that's hopeful without shying away from difficult topics or difficult realities.
I'm so glad you said that about hopeful. We're all about hopeful. So some quick housekeeping. There are a few email notification noises throughout this episode. Not too many, and it shouldn't be very distracting, but I want to give our listeners a little heads up.
Yep. So let's get to our interview with David Orr. David, thank you so much for joining us. It is an absolute honor to have you and just thrilled to have you with us today.
Well, Monica, thank you. It's great to be here.
Hi, good morning, Monica and David. Thrilled to start off a week with both of you.
Oh my God, it's so exciting. So David, I want to jump in. We have known you for a while. You've been friends with Serenbe and Steve Nygren and the whole environmental crew in this part of the world. But you have been a part of the environmental movement for years and years and years. And so we want to sort of dig into all of these different things. But I want to kick off the conversation by saying you have taken environmental movement and then you've, with your most recent book, with Democracy Unchained, really started to have deeper conversations about how we need to have a democratic government, democracy, in order to be able to save the environment. What led you to this place in your current career? And that's a big question.
Big question.
Well, tie this to Georgia. I went to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, where I did my PhD work in political science. So I was conditioned to think about politics and then got involved in environmental stuff kind of indirectly. Ian McHarg, the great landscape architect, who I think probably influenced a lot of the thinking around Serenbe, was teaching at Penn at that time, and he was in full stride in a magnificent career and had just published his landmark book on ecological design, just simply called Design with Nature. I sat in on Ian's classes, and that really set me off in a very different direction. And from Penn, my wife and I moved to Atlanta And I taught at Agnes Scott College for 5 years before going to the University of North Carolina. And while I was at Agnes Scott, Jimmy Carter and I were both on the board of the Georgia Conservancy. And that got me involved in the political aspects of the environmental movement early on. And so the fights then were over dams and wilderness protection in Georgia and so forth. That was really the start of it. And my first academic articles in political science were on the connection of environmental policy and environment, or the democratic system. And so this was early on. And the environmental movement, of course, was in full swing at that time in the early 70s. Most of the environmental laws that are still on the books and have yet to be improved much were passed between 1968 and 1977. And before leaving Georgia, I was on my way to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I was working as a kind of minor figure in Jimmy Carter's campaign in 1976 for the presidency. And he asked if Cecil Phillips at the Georgia Conservancy and I would organize a paper on the most important environmental issue his administration would face. Mm. And so we did. We adjourned to a lodge in North Georgia, the Wolf Creek Lodge, which I think is now defunct or owned differently. And we assembled people like Amory Lovins and Eugene Odom, who at the University of Georgia was the father of modern ecology as a science. And Herman Daly, the great economist. And we had an all-star crowd there. And we drafted this paper called the Wolf Creek Statement, which still reads well. 50 years on, it still is right on. But we don't have a de jure legally binding climate policy. Mm-hmm. That was really the start of it. And it began very much around Atlanta, the politics around the Carter administration as governor at that time. So that was the beginning of it. I had a footnote to that. As an academic, that was a period in which an enormous amount of intellectual capital was assembled. There were just a lot of good books and a lot of good thinking. It hasn't been improved much since. There's been a lot of stuff written, but that really was an incredible era.
Yeah. And that's interesting because it was a very bipartisan topic, right? A lot of the laws were passed by Nixon even. So one of the things that really struck me, and I'd love to hear how you managed it over the past couple of years, is your book was coming out at the beginning of COVID. And I know Steve was going to go and our friend Pete Dominic, and you had a whole luminaries. I think we're going to be launching it at the National Cathedral in DC. And this little thing called COVID happened. I was so excited about that book and for you to do that tour. Tell me how it has been received, because it's super important, but I don't know if it's been overshadowed with so many other things that have been happening. How have you been able to get that message out? And the book is, for our listeners, Democracy Unchained, How to Rebuild Government for the People. What's happened since then? I mean, besides...
We had a weekly chat with the National Cathedral staff. And about 2 weeks before the event, the book came out early March, we had planned to follow the publication of the book with 14 events across the country, starting at the National Cathedral.
Yeah.
And then going to the San Francisco Commonwealth Club and back to the New England Aquarium and then off to LA and so forth. But we're going to crisscross the country with teams of authors in the book and some others. And the cathedral staff, in our call about 2 weeks before the event, said, hey, we got good news and we got bad news. And the good news was they were going to have a full cathedral with the main nave filled in both wings. The bad news was they were going to have to cancel the event. And so what we did was to make a pivot. We hired an incredible company here in Cleveland that had done work for Aspen Institute and Vanity Fair magazine and so forth. And we did 11 online events, which attracted a very sizable audience of give or take 1 million.
Wow.
And 98 participants that included Van Jones, Jim Clyburn from Congress, ending with Terry Tempest Williams, but 98 people gathered, an incredible crowd of people, around 11 episodes.
Wow.
And we got caught halfway through that. In the first 4 or 5, we had nearly 700,000 viewers. And then we got caught in the political campaign of 2020. And Facebook basically took us off because they thought our content was political. And this raises an interesting point about politics, because we were not being political in the standard sense of being left or right. We were being political in the same sense that if you imagine a football game with no rules, no referees, and teams show up with Uzis and hand grenades, that's not football. That's war. And so we were trying to defend democracy, but defending democracy then was interpreted, oh, that's partisan. That's a democratic thing. And that highlights one of the geologic fault line in American politics, where we cannot discuss how we maintain this democratic conversation And historically, over the years, between equality and freedom, the point on that line will shift back and forth as parties struggle for this historically, or this built-in conflict with politics. But our focus was not to be conservative or liberal. You can be for environmental stuff as conservatives or as liberals. It can be done either way. But our focus in that book, and in the one coming out next year, is on the rules of the game that allow a democratic conversation to go on. If the conversation falls and you have a one-party state that says, we don't want to talk about these things, that's not democracy. So democracy is about our capacity to talk about our differences and through our differences with civility, thoughtfulness, and always a real concern for what keeps that conversation going. So that's what happened out of it. We're now in a fourth phase. I don't know if you want to talk about the fourth phase now, but we are focused now pretty much on just the intersection of climate change and democracy.
And I also love that you just said about civility too, because civility is that thread of how we speak to democracy and ecology. And I feel like civility has gone by the wayside. I'm sure you see that in your work every day, since people are taking sides in terms of this is more political versus environmental. And I think what your work is, which you can kind of talk this more about, everything is environmental. Every choice that we make, how we live our lives, everything we do has a reaction to the environment. So how do you speak to that in terms of bringing that civility back to those conversations?
That's a good point. One of the people that we had in the 11 online episodes was Jill Lepore from Harvard. We did have Republicans. Anna Trevor Potter, former head of the Federal Elections Commission, was one of our participants and so forth. One illustration of that, in 2017, when we launched this effort, we had a conference at Oberlin before I retired from Oberlin, on the state of American democracy. And one of the highest rated things in that 3-day conference with incredible people, Jane Mayer from New Yorker, and ending with William Barber 3 days later, it was an amazing group. But one of the things that caught people's attention as the best of it was a conversation with Pete Wehner and Bill Ritter. And Pete Wehner, former member of the Bush administration, evangelical, Christian, very conservative. Bill Ritter, former governor of Colorado, a Democrat, a liberal, and so forth. They sat in 2 chairs and talked. And it was after dinner, so there's no automatic cutoff. Go as long as we wanted. And it went on for about 2.5 hours.
Wow.
And it was a conversation between 2 very thoughtful, humorous, caring people that had been around the block a time or two and understood politics, and they were terrific. And it was an example of the kind of conversation we need to have. One thing I think that we have to do, and in answer to the question, I think we need to remember our history. In the Carter years before, it wasn't nirvana, but people in different parties could talk to each other. Members of Congress would argue in the Capitol in the daytime, play poker at night, and have dinner with their wives. And so there was conversation, and they cared about each other, disagreed about the political things. 1980 was a watershed. And in Georgia, Newt Gingrich was part of the problem. He very overtly, very vocally said, we've got to be nasty in politics. And that was his word, not mine. We've got to learn to be nasty and bomb throwing. And so Newt Gingrich's career in Congress, I wouldn't blame it all on that, but he vocalized this radical movement. Mm-hmm. And beginning way back in our history, back all the way to the Anti-Federalists, but then magnified in our time in the Reagan administration, government became the problem. Reagan said this very deliberately. The government's a problem. And the scariest words in English language are, I'm here from the government to help you. And so there was this anti-government thing that was given standing in the American political dialogue, and it destroyed the dialogue, or helped to destroy the dialogue. And so anything was permissible. And from about that point on, there were no enemies to the right. There was nobody that went too far. And the bombing of the Murrah building in Kansas City was a test case for that. Most Republicans found it very hard to condemn the bombers in that case. That was an act of domestic terrorism by a U.S. person, a white guy come out of the military. Mm-hmm. So the tone of American politics shifted. It became permissible to say all kinds of things. And then I think in the last administration, I don't mean to blame this all on Republicans, but there was a permissiveness to be dismissing we the people, what we can't do. Now we're in the middle of a case where it's permissible simply to challenge election results and throw them out because the Democrats, in the view of hardcore right-wing Republicans, are not a legitimate political party. And Obama was born somewhere else, and he was an illegitimate president, and this has all been stolen from us. And so it was a gradual process into a quicksand that can quite easily destroy democracy. I think we hang by a fairly slender thread. And I think time is very short to put some of these things right, but to contest the electoral process by any means necessary because the other side is so evil.
Right.
And then it doesn't take much fake news or QAnon nuttiness.
Right.
Just take this off the edge. And if we can't talk, and if we don't have a body of facts and data and logic and history that we can, for the most part, agree to, then I think that we're in serious jeopardy. I've probably gone off the, Jen, for your question, but
No, not at all.
it's a bit of a dire situation, and I don't mean to overstate it. I just think that the evidence suggests when something like 70% of the opposition party believes that the election was stolen from them, and then they have access to Fox News, they have their own independent media, they have hate radio, and pioneered by Rush Limbaugh. I mean, this has been a gradual process, a march toward what the founders of the country feared deeply. It would be demagoguery would take us down.
Right.
Not be an outside invading force. We would do it ourselves. Democracies, as John Adams once said, end by mostly committing suicide. We're in a process now with a loaded gun, and we can easily do this. So the time is, I think, fairly short to get this back on track. The connection with climate change and environment is this. I think in our case, it's essential that if we want to save the climate, we first have to fix democracy. And this puts us in a bind. It's a little bit like being on a fire truck headed for a 5-alarm fire and the engine fails. And now all of a sudden on the way to the fire, you've got to become a mechanic. You've got to fix the means to stop the fire. In the meantime, the fire is getting worse. And so we've been stymied from doing anything very serious about energy policy and climate change and lots of other issues because the machinery by which we make public choices and public decisions, public policy, has been pretty badly compromised. We can't agree. And in the middle of COVID and so forth, we found agreement hard to come by.
Mm-hmm.
So people like Joe Manchin is a coal man. New York Times expose of his finances showed that he's deeply indebted to coal, and coal is a big part of his $500,000 annual take-home pay from the industry and so forth. So he's going to defend it. I think that the fossil fuel politics, the cork in the bottle between the era of Jimmy Carter and our own time, is fossil fuel money, what Jane Mayer calls dark money. We can't account for it. The Supreme Court has legitimized it, given it standing and so forth. So I think I'm going off on a tangent, but I think that underscores the current work that we're trying to do on democracy and climate.
I think it helps to understand this and to recognize it and to face it and to talk about it in order to then make change. And I think not the simple thing, but I think we all have to go fight and share and get people out to vote, vote. Be a part of the process, right? Understanding the problems is good, but we're always trying to figure out how do we provide some hope for people? Because I don't know about you, but I get to the point where I'm like, I don't know what to do. I'm paralyzed. And doing nothing isn't the answer either. And taking my ball and going home, right? Because everybody is playing different games. We're not playing the same. The rules of the game matter, which I think is something that you say, and we're just not playing the same game, or we're not playing the same level of the game, right? To your point about we got to get nasty in politics came from Newt Gingrich. I think the Democrats don't really want to play that way. They like to be more conciliatory, but I think it's not working. So where do we go from here? So to turn it back to biophilia, we think of that as a centering concept. And we can talk about ecology or all these words, right? But biophilia at this point is not a co-opted word. It's not a co-opted concept by either side. We are all a part of it. We could talk about humanity and humans, but I think that maybe misses the plants and the animals and that we're all part of this main thing. So where did that come into your life, biophilia? And was that something very early on, having probably known E.O. Wilson and his work? And how do you feel about it? Do you feel like that can be an answer, is to find a common ground together in the love of all living things?
Yeah, absolutely. And it came in when Wilson published his book. I'm a reader, as you can tell from my background.
I love it. So are we.
I read Biophilia way back when it was first published in the early 80s. And the core of that, I think, is possibly the keystone to healing the breach that we see politically. So when I came to Oberlin, I preceded that with 11 years in the Arkansas wilderness. We built an environmental education center in Arkansas, and that's a whole nother story. But we started an effort the mid-90s to build a building that reflected the biophilic sentiments. Yeah. And I was publishing, it was one of the co-authors, a book called The Biophilia Hypothesis with Ed Wilson and a lot of other really, really good people. And they were architects, they were thinkers, they were philosophers and so forth. But is this a substrate of a very different kind of civilization that begins with reverence for life? And so that came in early on, and it was very sympathetic or very similar to what Ian McHarg had been saying in his book, Design with Nature, when I was a grad student at the University of Pennsylvania a million years before. The essence of it is really quite interesting because the Adam Joseph Lewis Center that we built here on the Oberlin campus didn't explicitly refer to biophilia, but it was all about biophilia. Mm-hmm. The word was prominent. And Janine Benyus, great book on biomimicry, and it was part of the design team, and Amory Levins and lots of people. We had a design team of kind of all-star people back in the mid to late 1990s that were involved in all of this conversation. But I think that biophilia is important in what we're doing now in three different ways. One is it starts to define the physical spaces that we build around ourselves. It can be democratic and linked to nature, or it can be otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so there is a physical form to democracy. There's a physical form to biophilia that includes natural systems and daylighting and white sound and sustainable agriculture and all of these kinds of things, the physical presence of humanity on the planet. So that is critically important. And secondly, I think it's important in the educational world. It's important in how we design schools and buildings and the world we build around ourselves that young people experience every day. That's just their background normal. And if they come to think of sunshine and photovoltaics and natural materials and natural landscaping as simply, that's just the way it is. And it's easy to do that. It's hard to do something else. So in terms of education, the take-home message is that nobody should be allowed to graduate from 6th grade, 12th grade, college or university or PhD without understanding how the world works as a physical system and how that influences our design, why that's important for their lives and careers. That's a priority. No school, nobody should get out of a college or university, and nobody should be allowed to sit in Congress without understanding the same thing. Imagine if we had a biophilic or ecologically literate Congress and Senate. And then the third thing here is that nobody should be allowed to graduate without having a background in civics and democracy and why that is important in their career. And nobody should be allowed to graduate without understanding those two things. Biophilia, or how the world works as a physical system, and democracy are related. They're flip sides of the same coin. And so building a curriculum around the way the earth works physically at all scales, from the climate up here to the garden in your backyard, I think that becomes a basis for a very different kind of curriculum. But it's linked. It's what Pope Francis in Laudato Si called integral ecology. It's not a subject out there. It's the bedrock of the framework within which all education occurs. And I think that if we did these things, that would help us understand that truth is not so relative. There's a certain truth that pervades the natural systems, and we call it earth system science or natural history or whatever you want to call it. But there are certain facts that we know these are true. And it gets us past this era in which fake news and QAnon and so forth are corrupting the public dialogue and corrupting our capacity to see what's real in the world and what's phony.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you, to that extent, in your personal opinion, I'm curious because I'm thinking about like what's happened in the past 50 years in democracy and our environment. Do you think a lot of that is because we've gone indoors so much? Like we've had the greatest migration indoors and we're not teaching it in schools. And then we're just spending so little time, and children have spent so little time outdoors that we aren't even aware of our own surroundings, that everyone thinks it's something other than ourselves. So maybe we put it into the curriculum. I'm curious if you think that also maybe has a big part to play in the democracy of how we look at the environment.
Oh, Jennifer, absolutely. And Steve Nygren and I were both part of Children of Nature Network. Mm-hmm. And one of my heroes in the world is Rich Louv, who's...
We love Richard Louv. I think he's one of our heroes.
Well, I think he really hit a chord, and it's also something that appeals across this political divide. And one of the great things about biophilia or getting children back out in nature and the work of CNN, Children in Nature Network, is that it is apolitical.
Yep.
I can live in Alabama or New York or California or Nevada, and yes, I want my kids outdoors. So, Jennifer, I couldn't agree more. You said that very well. I think we become an indoor species. And this also plays into the addictive quality of the internet.
Yes.
And if you're on a plane, the first thing when the pilot lands is people pull out their cell phones. I don't know what they're all checking. Everybody's looking out the window. It's a habit, and it's a habit becoming an addiction. Mm. And I think that we have to break that addiction. And part of that is to begin to devise algorithms that don't hook us into this addictive cycle. And also, and this is another point, this may be a side point, but I think what's happened in large measure is if you want to appeal to fear and greed and the nasty side of us, you're appealing to the old reptilian brainstem. Mm-hmm. If you want to get people to think about decency and sustainability and all charity and loving nature, that's the frontal lobe. And that's a whole different process. It's easy to get people to be afraid of stuff and angry and then go to a shopping mall in Buffalo, New York, kill people because you've been told they want to replace you. There's no lifting there. But if you want to get people to act decently as legitimately Homo sapiens, you have to appeal to the frontal lobe. That's thinking. And sustainability and all this stuff about biomimicry, it's complicated. You have to know some things, and you have to be verifiable. And you have to live in the world of sunshine and facts and animals and in a spirit of reverence for life, which is the key of way back at Albert Schweitzer's day to our own. That's so critical.
I like that. Sunshine, facts, and animals. That could be a new book title.
Exactly.
I should trademark that.
Yeah, trademark it now. We may make it the title of this episode. But I think we all sit in that place, right? And that is such a commonality. And the majority of people are good and want these things. And to your point, the internet or a lot of the media, whatever side the media is on, wants ratings. And it kind of goes to money, the money game, right? They want ratings. And so they're going to give you the reptilian things, the fear, the outrage, the anger. They want to engage you in those ways versus a more thoughtful conversation, which even somebody who loves to read and like takes the Atlantic and the New Yorker and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, like we have all this media coming in that we still are doing the print because to try and have that focus, I find it's gotten harder and harder for me to concentrate and to read those longer format things, which I absolutely adore. And I definitely attribute it to the internet and this dopamine hit that you're getting constantly of scrolling or getting likes or whatever, that the long format article or book just can't hold my attention. And that's a huge problem from somebody who wants to, let alone people who aren't avid readers or haven't really been that way in their lives. Like, how do we reach them?
Ask an easier question, would you? There are endless number of possible answers, and I don't have an answer to it.
Yeah.
I ran up my flag on the flagpole of higher education a long time ago.
Yeah.
So I've been in and around it for more years than I can count, I think. So one of the things is that the way we educate and one of the things that does connect us, we've all done hard time in schools from kindergarten up through PhD or whatever. The way we educate can help or hinder this. And the clock speed of our civilization is way too fast. We can't digest all this stuff. We can't react to all this. And you buy a smartphone today, it's going to be obsolete in 2 months. We cannot react fast enough. We're just not designed that way. We evolved with very different characteristics that were more calibrated to the way the natural world worked around us, hunting seasons and animal migrations and so forth. So I don't know what you do about it, but I know we need to start talking about it. And early on, and the only institutions that really know how to talk to people, one is religion and the other is education. And religion can be as divisive as politics can be. And so education, which we've come to devalue, I think, inappropriately, needs to be the place where we teach early on computer literacy. So young people know what they're getting and they can recognize the signs of addiction. And then Rich Lou's idea and the idea of all the really good educators now is get kids outdoors, have school gardens, get them outside, field trips. The best education does not occur in classrooms. It's going to occur outdoors with instructors or just unsupervised time in the woods. And when I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, and we had surrounded by farmland and woods and an orchard. And I was out, and I didn't come home at night until dinner, and that was just normal. The kids were out playing around, doing our thing. Most of it unsupervised up to a certain age. But I think the way we design schools can help break that addiction. And so think of schools, if schools were just automatically solar powered with gardens and wastewater facilities on campus, and kids, the buildings become their own curriculum. And so when we did the Adam Joseph Lewis Center, that was very much the goal back in the 90s, build a building that becomes its own curriculum. The way the building was built, how it's operated, even to this day, 20 some years later, the building is still teaching students by the way it's designed, by the way energy systems are monitored, by the way the gardens are run. We had a pond on site a couple weeks ago. The students got out in the pond and helped clean up the pond and take out old vegetation we didn't want and so forth. And they're out there in their shorts and bathing suits in the water and pulling things out with supervision by the biology staff. But get kids outdoors, I think, is one way to begin to do this. Again, it's a good question, Monica, and I don't have an answer. It's going to be a civilizational dialogue. And we have to build places that kids want to be. Oklahoma City has a park, and I forgot the name of it now, but it's Reconciliation Park or something like that, right on the banks of a river that runs through Oklahoma City. Or I'm sorry, I think it's Tulsa. And the idea is to begin to build open spaces that connect housing nearby and schools and so forth. And think of cities designed to be generally biophilic, where you have wildlife corridors, and you take the High Line in New York City is a great example of old industrial technology rendered into a really kind of cool walking space and space elevated above the streets of New York. But there are ways to begin to think about this. And biophilia, when you think about it, is a pretty radical concept in industrial civilization. It's counter to a good bit of what we thought was true in the 1900s as we were building steel plants and industrializing and so forth. It is to honor that ancient connection between our planet and ourselves and to draw the conclusions of what that connection means for how we feed ourselves, how we build, how we entertain, how we transport, and how we make an economy work.
One of the things, so many thoughts come to mind. I feel like I could sit here and talk to you for hours, but just to make a note, Jennifer had sent me an article, and I think it was in Time Out, maybe London, New York, all about daylighting, how all of these underground rivers, if you will, where we hid all the water systems are now being, quote, daylighted. And to see that in a mainstream publication, if you will, it wasn't in a green building article, but in a mainstream publication, that makes me hopeful. And to see biophilia, really biophilic design. And to your point, like if we can start talking about how that can define the physical space first, that is trending right now. And I don't know if that's because we spent so much time in our homes that we understood the impact of nature over these past years. We really have come to hold it in a higher regard, right, of what's surrounding us and what that space is doing to us. And obviously that has been in the commercial space for a while, if you will, with LEED. And, I think the Biomimicry Institute's doing incredible work, and Living Futures with the Living Building Challenge with the Candida building here is probably built upon that Adam Joseph Lewis Center, right, to Georgia Tech to have this building that's a sort of a teaching environmental building. But I think that the idea that we forget, like we have been living in like this linear world, and it's all about more. We have to keep the GDP going, so more consumerism. We have to build more things, manufacturing, it's all efficiency, Sigma. That in a way is kind of what I grew up with, right? I was born in the 70s. So it's like this linear world, right? But what we really need to go to, and hopefully maybe biophilia will help it become more mainstream, is the circular world. And people talk about a circular economy, but I don't know if people really understand what that means. Can you talk a little bit about that, like linear versus circular, and how that mimics nature? And is there hope in sharing that concept with people?
Monica, your point about daylighting streams, it's a metaphor that also fits Children of Nature Network and biophilia, daylighting human beings, getting back out in sunshine. I'd say two things about the circular economy. One is, if you ask people, what makes you happy? When are you at your happiest? It's not going to be, oh, I was watching this television program and I just hit this emotional high, and or I was at the mall and they had a sale on that day and I was buying all this stuff, and just my spiritual well-being. I felt so whole, and as I was passing the cash register. On the circular economy, this is an old concept. In 1973, when I was in Atlanta, Bob Leslie, who was a colleague of mine at Agnes Scott College, and I organized the first of two citywide or region-wide events called the Atlanta Environmental Symposium. And the first one was on the limits to growth and the Atlanta region. And the book had come out from MIT, Donella Meadows and so forth, come out in 1972, I think it was. We had the conference in 1974, part in 1973. So the rule was we brought in all these speakers, including members of the team from the Limits to Growth from MIT and the Secretary of Interior Udall and Ralph Nader, and we had a full crowd for a 3-day event. And the rule was that every speaker had to come and give 2 talks. And Herman Daly, who had just published his first reader, Herman Daly was an incredible economist. He's still alive, retired from the University of Maryland. He wrote a book called Steady State Reader, or it was a series of articles about the steady state or circular economy.
Okay.
And it dated back, he had an article in the book or section from a book by John Stuart Mill in 1848 on the need to stop growing economies and so forth. And so it goes way back. And I remember we had Herman Daly give a talk at the CNS Bank, which at that time was the largest bank in the Southeast. It's now been bought out. And the luncheon talk to which Herman addressed was made up of the Federal Reserve bankers and all the banking community from the Atlanta region. And so Herman, and I remember this in 1973, Herman gave this talk about the limits to growth and the fact that physics are more basic than the laws of economics. I mean, the laws of physics go way back, how many billion years since the creation. And the laws of economics, we assume, started in probably 1776 with the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And so the bankers sat there, and Herman explained this in very dry, straightforward terms. It was not an ideological talk. It was not a stem winder, but explained why the laws of entropy will limit economic growth. And so if you think of this as a pipeline, the more stuff you pump through the pipeline from wells, mines, forests, and farms, the bigger problem you have at the other end. But it all becomes waste. And then since it only goes in one way, you can't reverse this process. You take a lump of coal, you burn it. The coal isn't the thing isn't destroyed. It just changes form. It goes up into heat and ashes and smoke and so forth. So as he's explaining this to the bankers, I was sitting at the back of the room thinking, this isn't being absorbed. They gave him polite applause, and then everybody dissolved and went back to making the Atlanta metro region grow.
As we can see today, it's crazy.
Well, Jimmy Carter, probably 10 or 12 years ago, and I had dinner together, and he asked me if I remembered the conference we did on the limits to growth. And I said, yes, sir, I do. I remember it. And his response back was, well, it was a good thing we did that conference, because if we hadn't, Atlanta would have really sprawled.
That's funny.
That's interesting.
And since that time, the thinking about Kate Rayworth's book, Donut Economics and so forth, there's been a huge literature on why we have to rethink what growth is and how possible it is and how to make it more equitable and fair. Most all of this was preceded by Herman Daly, and his reader that we used in 1973, he followed with a series of probably a half a dozen or more books on the subject, and then probably hundreds of articles. And so there's a well-developed literature on why this is important. But it begins with the laws of physics. And then it also includes the laws of decency, humanity, and distribution, and so forth. You can't separate these things out. What is a fair portion? And what we're trying to do in our work on democracy right now is also to address how this spills out to the future, because we now cast a long shadow on the future. If we just take our Constitution seriously with the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment, where we accord due process of law before depriving people of life and liberty and property, then we're already violating due process of future generations. We're leaving them a more threadbare, more riskier planet than we inherited years back. This is a matter that gets into law and justice and fairness and decency. It also, I think it's part of the Pope Francis, Laudato Si, talks about the need to develop a global perspective on this. And they genuinely for which we don't have the institutions now, but we have a moral obligation, he argued, to have a global perspective. So as we think about what makes the U.S. economy grow and so forth, we have to be thinking about that child in Africa or peasant in Asia and future generations. We have to have a larger perspective. And I would end this by saying this: at our second conference on American democracy here at Oberlin before I retired, Reverend William Barber, who is probably the best orator in the country now, said something that really stuck in my mind. He said, our ideas are too puny for our circumstances. Our ideas are too puny for our circumstances. We need larger ideas. We need to stretch out in time and stretch out in morality. It's not just about the next quarter. And I think as a reason for hope, if you break down what that economy looks like, and you ask the right questions of people, how many people would respond negatively to, do you want to drink clean water? Do you want to breathe clean air? Do you want a world of climate chaos, bigger storms, rising seas, famine, heat waves? The answers all come back on our side. We have a majority, a huge majority, 80, 90, 95% that would say, yes, I want to drink clean water. I want clean air. I want my kids to live in a decent world. I want to eat poisons. I want healthy food and so forth. Then the question is, how do you implement that worldview? And to use a different metaphor, think of standing on one side of the Grand Canyon and you want to bridge to the other side. And on the other side of the Grand Canyon are all those goals for a biomimetic future, green and lovely and fair and decent and so forth. We can get there. Most people want to get there, but the bridge that connects this side of the chasm with that side of the chasm is broken, or it's been rendered into a toll bridge only to the wealthy. And so one of the core aspects, and this goes way back into Greek thinking, you cannot have an oligarchy. You cannot have huge amounts of wealth corrupt the public decision-making process. That was known. Aristotle wrote about that, and all the democratic writers ever since have noted that. And the founding fathers, much reverenced on the conservative right of our country, had failed to point out that those founding fathers, flawed as they were, many were slave owners and so forth, they were fairly modestly wealthy or not wealthy at all. And they risked their lives and their fortunes in a fight with the British. Literally, had they lost the revolution, all of them would have been rounded up and most would have been killed. So they risked something for an idea that we, the people, would be up to doing our own business. And it's an idea, it's not perfect, but it's the core, I think, of the solutions we have to build worldwide. And there's nothing, W.E.B. Du Bois, the wonderful Black writer in 1919, basically said, he said it much better than I can repeat it, but the creativity at the base of society is essential to run that society. So if you want a democratic society, yes, you need voting rights up here, but you also need the vibrancy and the ecological literacy and the initiative down here. And that's where biomimicry comes in. You can't legislate biomimicry in any way that I know, but you can begin to implement it in places like Serenbe and like housing developments and like schools and properties and city development plans and plans for parks and open spaces that get people out into that area. Well, I've gone off on a tangent, so I've blown the whole interview here.
No, God, David, we could sit in here and listen to you forever. I remember listening to an interview you did with Pete Dominic and just being like, okay, Pete, just bring him on every day. Just, that's all I want. I just want David Orr every day. A little bit of David.
Well, Pete Dominic brings out what do you want to call it? Fire and brimstone or whatever. He's such a wonderful interviewer.
Yes, he really is.
And his politics align pretty much with mine. So we have this essential agreement about things. The last thing I would summarize is when you taught politics, or when I was taught politics a long time ago, you taught that politics is about who gets what, when, and how. And the what in this case is air, water, land, wildlife, stable climate. That is, the environment is ultimately the what in that equation. And so all of this comes down to politics. And people say, and I have relatives that say, gee, look, I'm not political. Now, I'm getting into interfamily stuff here. I'm not political. And my answer back is, there is no way you can be apolitical. You stand simply for the politics of the status quo. If you're happy with the status quo, fine. That's political. You're going to support it by being apathetic. I had a college dean once tell me that we were a college, not a cause, to which my response was, you cannot be a college without a cause. again, the same logic. If you say, gee, we have no cause, we're just neutral in all this stuff, then your cause is a status quo. If you're happy with the status quo, fine, but that's a cause. And so we're all in this politically. And I think one of the things that would help in all of these fights, biomimicry and environmental stuff, is to take a position, ask what would our great-grandchildren wish that we were doing now or would have done now? Mm-hmm. What would they hope our agenda would be and our perspectives and our values and what we sacrifice for them? Because we live as a result of incredible sacrifices by previous generations, starting, the Revolution, the Civil War, World War II, and just innumerable people, teachers and firefighters and people who just courageously do the public business. We live because they were willing to sacrifice and had a larger view of things. And so we've got to break the thraldom that we have toward the consumer economy. Mm-hmm. And begin to be good citizens. One of my favorite illustrations is Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas in a campaign for the Senate in Illinois in 1858. We know of it as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And if you go back and read the transcripts from those debates, the audience, mostly relatively uneducated farmers, standing. They were not in an air-conditioned auditorium, and no sound system. But thousands of them would stand within earshot of the speakers who had to project out to them for hours. And Lincoln and Douglas, two of the intellectual giants of the time, debated the big issues of their time. And that was obviously slavery and sexualism and the tariff and so forth. And you go back and you read that, and the transcript will say the audience applauded or jeered or laughed or whatever, but they were reacting to the speeches. Mm-hmm. And within a couple of years, many of those people that were reacting went off to fight and die for some of the ideas that they heard. Those were citizens. And they were paying the price. They weren't just consumers. They obviously consumed, but in this ratio of consumer to citizen, they were more citizen than they were consumer. And ideas were important to them. And Lincoln and Douglas, in those debates, carried that on. We have to relearn the art and the reason why we need to be citizens.
Well, and I think the idea of a citizen collective and the storytelling, I think that storytelling is so important. I mean, I think everybody, we know that in this sort of quote environmental movement, everybody understands that that's what moves people is the storytelling. But I think that it's in us, right? It's in us to sacrifice and to come together. And we see little gleams of it, little pieces of sunshine over the years when terrible things have happened. We've come together, even if it's just been momentarily. But I think having some leadership, and that can come from anywhere, right? That actually asks us to do a collective good as a citizen, to your point. I feel like a bit that's what we're looking for. And maybe, we just need to do it ourselves, right? We can't just sit here and wait for somebody to come save us. We've got to save ourselves. And so the conversations, which is where Jennifer and I sit, and I think the professors, the work that you've done, are the ones with the knowledge, and getting the word out is so important. And maybe if people aren't reading books, we can translate it into a podcast, or if people aren't listening to podcasts, we can translate it into a TV program. Right. But I do think that the citizenry is ready to take up a challenge, and we're just not sure where to go. There's so many, quote, challenges right now, and it's almost like nobody's asking us to sacrifice, if you will.
Your point about narrative is really good. And narratives are tricky because the American narrative has been about the progress of Western civilization. We arrived on this empty continent, and we swept across it. We built railroads, and we conquered the West, and so forth. And from a Native American perspective, the quote winning of the West was anything but. From an African American perspective, the winning of the Civil War takes on a very different meaning than it does for diehard Southerners. And it connects to this, two comments here, connects to this book banning and critical race theory argument.
Yeah.
And the point is that we need to learn the truth. And to be biblical, the truth is always something seen through a glass darkly. But we need to tell ourselves the truth about it. So right now, the tragedy of Russia invading Ukraine, because of this flawed view of their history that Vladimir Putin had, and people like Ivan Ilyin and so forth. And people die when you get the truth wrong. The narrative needs to be corrected as we see more clearly. So it's like seeing a picture with fairly few pixels, and there's more and more pixels, and the picture gets clearer and clearer. And our own history is a little bit like that. The further away you get from some of this stuff. So in that Ken Burns series on the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest was seen as one of the military geniuses of the Civil War. He also was the founder of the KKK.
Yeah.
And was terribly brutal to African-American prisoners captured in the Civil War. And so we need to see, it's a continual refinement as we see more clearly and evidence becomes more available and so forth. And the painful thing is that people connect their lives with certain narratives. But if the narratives are flawed, the lives are flawed. The stories we tell ourselves are critically important. And the story we ought to be telling ourselves is that we tell ourselves stories.
Yeah. Well, and then that can go into cognitive bias, and I want to believe what I want to believe, and I surround myself with people with the same thoughts. And so I don't know if that leads us into what you're working on today, the next book, and like how we can support your work. Yeah.
Well, the next book is called Democracy in a Harder Time. I've got 16 authors. I'm the editor of it. I've got 16 incredible authors that include a landscape architect who's running a project out of Arizona State University called 10X, which is 10X is the highway that runs across the southern tier of the United States from Jacksonville to Los Angeles. And so he's interviewed or working with 10 big cities along that corridor. And there are two teams working on constitutional governance issues. And both are working with different variants of the question that if the founders knew then, speaking 1787 and 1789, what we know now about how Earth works as a physical system, how would they then have designed or written a constitution and designed governing institutions for a world of feedback loops, positive, negative, leads and lags, long time gaps between cause and effect, and a world of lots of nasty surprises? What would that government be like? And what would that constitution be like?
Wow.
So those are two different chapters in the book. So we're trying to ask those questions that are adequate to our circumstances, to cite William Barber again. MIT Press is the publisher. We plan to take this out across the country and events from Los Angeles to New York and expose some of the authors and get them on television. And we're putting together a fairly extensive publicity campaign and getting them on television, op-eds and podcasts and so forth. Wow. And then one of the things around this, we're working with a group of students from Arizona State University, University of Denver, University of Colorado, Colorado State, and some other institutions across the country. And we want to get them to do podcasts with the trustees of their various institutions and their faculty and administrators and begin to get them thinking beyond where they typically think. The university, as it's presently conceived, may not be much of an asset in getting to that biomimetic or sustainable or resilient and fair and decent world. The jury is still out on that. We're still turning out people out of economics departments, for example, who still think economic growth must happen, and still turning out scientists and engineers who are all about mastery of nature and extending human control of nature on our terms, not nature's terms. So if you were to think, given biomimicry, what it stands for in the fullest sense of the word, how would we design a university? Or the whole educational process. What does curriculum look like? And the greening campus movement, which has been great, they've done incredible work over the last 30 years or so. It's been mostly about infrastructure, energy efficiency and buildings and so forth. That's the hardscaping. What about the softscaping?
Yeah.
How do we think?
Love that.
And turning out young people who understand the linkages and patterns and our obligatedness in the world, our implicatedness, as J. Glenn Gray once put it, in the world, including the world of nature, animals, and the future of life. One last point on this. I think biomimicry holds out. It's easy to get caught up in what a friend of mine, Wes Jackson, once called "ain't it awful" stories. All those curves going up like this and down like that, and oh my God, there's no hope. And what biomimicry holds out is redemption, that we can do better. We are not fated to destroy the planet, to either blow it up or heat it to death or get ourselves evicted with AI, artificial intelligence, that we can do better. And that better is very much better. It's like, well, a little bit like Cerebee, Steve Nygren's vision of what those rolling hills south of Atlanta could be like. Human habitation that keeps a good bit of nature intact for all kinds of reasons. We can do a lot better. So biomimicry, and I think the circular economy and steady state economics, all these ideas, we're not short of ideas. The cork in a bottle, again, is political, but we can do better. And I think the hard work is not going to be in science or necessarily, it's going to be political.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's going to be changing hearts and minds of people who run for office. But I would also say one other thing. If you go get a driver's license in Georgia or Ohio or any place, you got to take a little test. You have to read a little book and take a little test and understand what shapes of signs mean. And that means stop and that means go, and red lights mean, you have to take a test. But you don't have to take a test to sit in the U.S. Senate. Which planet do you live on? When Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court said, in her hearing said, she was asked about climate change. Well, I've heard of it, but I'm not sure, Well, how does you graduate from law school without understanding the major legal problem for future generations? Mm-hmm. Every judge, every member of Congress, every member of a state representative ought to have to take some sort of educational equivalent of a driver's license test, lest they drive their state or their country into a ditch.
Right. School board members.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What planet do your kids live on?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's great. So when does the book come out? Can we pre-order it, or are we still in editorial stages?
We're still in the editorial stage. I will get final manuscripts from everybody late summer. MIT Press is going to get it out as quickly as they possibly can. So hopefully early 2023.
Fantastic.
So,
well, we'll definitely have you back for that. And I'm fascinated with the 10X highway idea. That's kind of a cool idea. So maybe we can interview some of the different people about the different chapters next year.
Duke Reiter, Reiter at Arizona State, is writing that chapter of the book. He is the author of the 10X project.
Okay.
It's brilliant. I mean, it stretches through from Jacksonville to LA and the 10 large cities on that highway.
All right. Well, maybe we'll have him on sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
He'd be great to interview.
Well, David, thank you for all the work you do. It's so important, and we appreciate it, and we really appreciate your time. And I know you're busy, so it's been an absolute delight.
Well, it's been delightful for me too. Monica, Jennifer, thanks. And Katrina, thanks for putting this all together.
Oh.
Thanks to the three of you.
Okay, Jennifer, my mind has been blown.
I know this is the most obvious statement ever, but he is so smart. I mean, I'm also so blown away by the depth of his knowledge, and that David has this way that he puts things into words, and they're so beautifully done.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so what were some of your biggest takeaways?
Okay. I mean, I have like almost 100 or so takeaways. So I guess I'll start with a couple of things David said about biophilia that struck a real chord with me. So the first thing was that biophilia can be a keystone for healing this political breach over the environment. Like, to your point, biophilia hasn't been politicized as an idea, and it also has something that people intuitively understand. So it can potentially be a way to center that conversation. And later on in the conversation, however, David talked about a bridge between where we are and the biophilic future we can see ourselves in.
Yeah, I was taken with the idea about the linear way we think about economic growth. And there seems to be an idea in society that there just isn't enough to go around, when in reality, we really have everything we need to help people thrive, but we're just maybe not distributing it the appropriate way. And then to David's point, we have the tools. We need to get back on track environmentally, but the political will or ability to get things done is really holding us back.
Absolutely. So on that note, during our interview with David, I thought about our episode a while back now with Jacqueline Patterson. Do you remember what she said when we asked her about how we can support her work to do our part to combat environmental racism?
Yeah, she said we need to be advocating for campaign finance reform. And it really struck me because it was one of those light bulb moments. I wasn't obvious and I wouldn't have really gotten there on my own, but I really appreciated her connecting the dots for us.
Yeah. Now seems like a great time to bring that idea back to the forefront. And I would also throw in something David said about how we need to make sure we're not violating the due process of future generations. This notion we've explored over and over again about becoming responsible ancestors and stewards of the earth, not for our own benefit as much as that of our descendants.
Yeah. So we hope you all love David as much as we did. We actually ended up talking to him for another 30 minutes or so once we finished the interview. And also our producer, Katrina, came into the conversation. It's a little off the cuff, but we felt like it provided further insight into David's work. So we're going to share it with you guys in a couple of weeks as a bonus episode.
That was really fun. And this is technically our first two-parter. So if you enjoyed the first episode, you're in luck. More is on the way.
All right. Talk to you later, Jennifer.
Bye, Monica.
Thanks so much for listening. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love for you to follow us on your favorite podcast app, give us a 5-star rating, and please leave us a review.
It really goes such a long way towards helping us reach a wider audience and sharing these amazing interviews and solutions with the world.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for following and reviewing the podcast, and we'll be back with another amazing interview in 2 weeks. You're now a part of the Biophilic movement.